once again is we're trying to see if there's what are the academic reasons behind people saying Jesus got it wrong when he said that the Old Testament Torah was written by Moses. And we're getting there. So we've talked about Babylonian myth, and in particular we talked about one that's got a funny name, Enuma Elish. E-1 Delish. Enuma Elish. That's just the name of it. And it's a 1,000-line poem in the original. So, next slide please. Before we do that, could you all please stand up? Now you don't have to do this if you're not a Christian, but I thought before we look at the myth, let's look at the history. So some of you might not have read Genesis chapter 1 and 2 for a long time. Don't worry, we're not going to read it all. These are some selected excerpts from me, and I'd like you to read along. I'm going to have my back to you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them. The Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Take a seat. So, let's look at a Babylonian myth that was unearthed in about 1840s, going back to a library from the 600s, and probably its sources came back from before then. This is an old story. You might have thought Tolkien books were old, but no, this is a really old story. So I'll tell you the story. So before the heavens were named, before the firm ground was named, before there were any gods, there was Apsu and Tiamat. These are gods. Apsu, apparently the god of the fresh water. I've depicted Apsu here as a Siamese fighting fish. I think that sort of depicts his nature. And Tiamat, his beautiful wife, who I've depicted here as a crocodile. No one really knows what they look like. So, being husband and wife, what do? You have kids. So they had a bunch of gods. So do we call them godlings or godlets? I'm not quite sure. But they had a whole bunch of gods. And all of you that have had kids know that that little bundle of joy makes a lot of noise. And the more you have of them, the more noise they make. And Apsu and Tiamat decided that these kids were making too much noise. Something had to be done. Both of them weren't happy. And Apsu said there's an obvious solution. The solution, kill them all. Tiamat wasn't quite so convinced this was a good idea, but Apsu kept on planning about how he's going to wipe out all of their children, all these gods that they had created. Ea was one of the gods. You can think of him as Ea. That's how I pronounce him, Ea came to the rescue. He thought, this is no good. So he mounted a fight against Apsu and won. So there's no more Apsu. There's just the Tiamat left bereaved without her husband. Ea, having won that battle, has his own wife, another god of course, and they sleep together and they have a wonderful son called Marduk. Next slide. Marduk was the pride and joy of their eyes. Marduk actually had 4 eyes and 4 ears, incredibly tall. He was a powerful god. But Tiamat is in the background. She is seething about the fact that Marduk's father killed her hubby. This isn't any good. So she decides she's going to kill Marduk. How's she going to do that? Well, she has 11 more progeny. These are dragons who are sharp of teeth and numerous in fame. And these dragons dragons go by different names. The great lion, the mad dog, the centaur, and dragonfly. I don't know about you, but if I had a whole bunch of brothers called Mad Dog, Great Lion, Centaur, and my mum named me after a little pretty insect, I'd be pretty peeved. But anyway, there was this guy called, this dragon beast called Dragonfly. So these 11, plus a whole bunch of other gods, tackle Marduk and his reign. Unfortunately, Tiamat, the croc, and these beasts, even poor little Dragonfly, all got destroyed. Marduk won the day. Marduk is the god of gods now. He is a big shot. He's the one to worship. So, next slide, please. So, Marduk is dead. How did he manage to kill her? Well, what he did was he managed to create big winds, massive winds that were so powerful that you couldn't shut a gob. And they went inside her belly, and they caused so much mayhem that she just bellowed up with her belly. Then he shot an arrow, went through the belly and into her heart and severed it, and she died. So that's how Marduk won his battle against Tiamat. But of course, he was a little bit of a creative guy. He thought, what am I going to do now with Tiamat? So he split her in half like a shellfish. That's what it says, split her in half like a shellfish. He used the top half to create a covering for the heavens and hitched her up there by her crotch. I thought that was very rude. You know, it's one thing to kill the woman, another thing to stick her up to the heavens by her crotch. Not normally part of the body that we make a song and dance about unless you're Michael Jackson. And then of course the belly, what did he do with the belly? Well, that became the night sky, the heavens that far away, the furthest, highest part of the heavens were made out of her belly. The moon god he caused to shine, and with his 6 horns and his crown would do his thing. And so this is what Marduk did with the top half. Oh, and the spit from her he used to make clouds. So very resourceful, really. What did he do with the bottom half? Well, he got his mace and he smashed a skull, smashed it to smithereens. So now, like a good orthopaedic surgeon, you've got bone dust. So he uses this bone dust as a foundation for mountains. It's just a foundation for mountains. Now, what do you think he created the mountains out of? Her breasts. Most blokes would think, oh yes, I've got these breasts, what am I going to do with them? I'll make them into mountains. So he made them into mountains, and he drilled holes in them so all the water could come out of them. That's where we get our springs. So that's what he did with the bottom half of her. The gods were celebratory at this point in time that Marduk had won this battle. So now it's time for a celebratory feast. And at the end of this feast, Marduk decided that he's going to make man to do the toil of the gods. That was the purpose of this creature he was going to make, to do the work of the gods so the gods could rest. But he had a problem, he needed some blood. So Ea says to him, why don't you use a god that no one's particularly keen on anymore? And that is the god who was the general for Tiamat. So Kingu, or Q-I-N-G-U, K-I-N-G-U. So they sacrificed Kingu, and with his blood, used it to create the bones of the man. And that's how we ended up with Lulu, the man, who was to do the work of the gods. The gods were then told to build a city. That city was called Babylon. I hope you're still following this myth. It's pretty colourful. He was supposedly a god who created some grain and barley, and also possibly the stars. So there you have it. That's the Enuma Elish, the founding myth for Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So what I'd like you to do now is stand up and turn to your neighbour and talk about the numerous analogies between these two myths, because that's what the books say. The books say it's obvious that Enuma Elish was a foundation for Babylon, for Genesis' creation account, because of the numerous parallels. So stand up, stretch your legs, and talk to the person around you about all the numerous parallels, the numerous analogies you can see between the two accounts. Some of the things you might notice as differences, now you've talked about all the similarities, some of the things you might notice in terms of differences, just some of them, is that Enuma Elish is mostly what we call a theogony, not a cosmogony. It doesn't really talk about creation, it talks about the gods and about where the gods came from and how they didn't get along. So that's the first big thing. The second big thing you might have noticed in terms of the difference, as opposed to all the similarities, is of course the fact that stuff came from gods. Gods made gods. That's how they came about. The stuff of the world came from gods. Even men had to come from the blood of gods. That's very different to what we read about in the Bible, where stuff just came out of nowhere under God's command. There's no 6+1 days. Violence and bloodshed is needed for the creation account or creation myth in Enuma Elish. It's not a passive creation setting. So it's another big difference. And finally, man. What's our place in the universe? According to the Bible, we have been specially made and designed by God. He did that because God is a God of love. And love always involves interactions, relationships. We have this Trinity. If there wasn't a Trinity, there wouldn't be a God of love. You can't have a God of love if there's no Trinity. And this Trinity, this God of love, wants to share the love with more and more of the world, with more and more. So that's why God created the world, that's why God created man, to share his love. And man was given a good position. What's the position of Lulu? What's the position of man in Enuma Elish? Just a slave. Just a slave. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So you might be wondering, well, apart from all those numerous analogies, what other evidence is there that Enuma Elish is the backbone for Genesis? Well, one of them is one word. So in Genesis 1 verse 2, earlier on tonight, we read about the face of the deep. The word deep there, as you can see on the slide, is, I gather it's pronounced Tihom. T-E-H-O-M-E, if you like, Tihom. And they say, these scholars that we were talking about before, Wellhausen and all the disciples since then, they say Tiamat, the Akkadian word for that woman goddess, that her name, when you take it over to Hebrew, is Tihom. And so the face of the deep is a reference to Enuma Elish. Oh, so obvious. So obvious, isn't it? Such strong evidence. How could you possibly refute that? Well, you can refute it because there is an Akkadian word called Tiamtu. And when you translate Tiamtu, which is a Semitic language in Akkadian, over to the Hebrew, which is also Semitic language, you end up with this perfect correlation. Tiamtu in Akkadian is spelled Tihom in Hebrew, and they have the same meaning and basically the same spelling. A bit like my book in Russian. Jonathan Clerke is not spelled J-O-N in the Russian book. Russians, to spell my first three letters, they spell it D-J-O-N. And so if you follow the transliteration rules, Tiamtu is Tihom. So there's no reason for trying to say that the face of the deep actually relates to Tiamtu. That's just fictitious. The Akkadian word for Tiamtu is obviously a proper noun. It's a noun like Brisbane and Las Vegas. Tihom in the Hebrew is never a proper name. So it is a pretty weak argument, I would say. Next slide, please. Okay. We'll just I was going to go and tell you another myth. So this is the Song of Ulukumi. We don't have time, unfortunately, but I just wanted to help you to see all the myths are just as crazy as each other. Next slide. I'll just very briefly, thank you very much, very briefly touch on it. In this myth, there's a god called Kanabi. Yeah, that'll do. Anyway, he hates the storm god, Tisul, and wants to win this battle. And so he needs to go and get help. So he goes off east to the Tigris, and he finds a rock, and he's pretty enamored with this rock. So he has sex with the rock, and gives life to Ulikumu. Ulikumu is a bit of a rock of a god. Now, if I was in that situation and given birth to a rock, I probably would have called it something like Led Zeppelin or the Rolling Stones, but he called it Ulikumi. So that just gives you an idea. These myths are wacko, really wacko. But if you wanted to find a parallel between the Genesis account and the Ulu Kumi with its sex with rocks type thing, you can find one. I found one. I found two actually, but that's another story. So let's go on to the next slide. We talked about Gilgamesh. So this is the last myth, the second myth that we're going to talk about in detail. Put your hand up if, like me, you heard some non-Christians or others ask you, what the heck is the Gilgamesh flood account about?
I've heard you ask it.
Okay, so now we've got a number on it. Good, thank you very much. So, interestingly enough, we call it the Gilgamesh flood story, but it's not really the Gilgamesh flood story. The story is about Gilgamesh, and a very small part of it is about Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim is the one who tells the flood story. So next slide, please. So who was Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh was made by the gods. He was 2/3 God, 1/3 man. And when I look at that fellow, I think, yeah, he could be 2/3 God, 1/3 man. Perfect of looks, perfect of body, the perfect man. He had a flaw though, he wasn't immortal. Wouldn't you feel ripped off? You're 2/3 God, you're 2/3 of the way there, and you're still immortal. What a bummer. So anyway, Gilgamesh develops a friendship, and this mate dies, and Gilgamesh's heart is stricken. He is really sad. Now this might be a surprise to you, because Gilgamesh wasn't a nice man. He had a rule that when a woman was having a wedding night, she would have to have sex with him first before a new husband. He made the men and women work hard. He wasn't a nice man. But when his friend died, he suddenly got these pangs of sorrow, and he became afraid of death, and he wanted immortality. So he goes on this great journey to find Utnapishtim. Now, why does he want to find this fellow called Utnapishtim? It's because Utnapishtim is the only man who managed to get immortal life, and he wants to find the secret. Sounds fair enough, doesn't it? So he goes on this hazardous journey. He kills lions and bears and panthers on the way. He's a bit of a sweet talker as well, so he talks his way past two guards who are half dragon, half men. He crosses a terribly dangerous and deadly ocean. He seizes and kills the bull of heaven. He is some man on a mission. He wants this immortality. Finally, he meets Utnapishtim. And he says, tell me how you became immortal, because I want to be immortal. And Utnapishtim now tells a flood story. And this is a flood story from Utnapishtim. And it might have some bells of familiarity. There was a stage on the earth where there were so many people, they were making a heck of a lot of noise. An awful lot of noise, a clamour. It was worse than the bellow of a bull. And so the gods decided that they should kill them all. Simple as that. And in fact, the god Elikim was the god who was mostly behind this. Ea comes to the rescue and thinks this is a bit drastic to kill them all. So Ea, as we heard about before, he goes down to Utnapishtim, who lives in a reed house. And apparently he goes to Utnapishtim because of an oath. Now, for many of you that have lived in other cultures where there are gods, typically you have an oath because of something you've done for them. So in this case, it might have been that Utnapishtim had made a sacrifice, and now the god Ea was indebted to him. So that's what it seems to read like. There's no other reason. So he comes down and warns Utnapishtim about this impending disaster. And he says, turn your house into a boat, a big boat. A boat that's shaped like a cube, by the way, a perfect cube. And Utnapishtim says, well, what am I going to tell all the people around me as I build this boat? And the god Ea says, well, you just lie to them. You just tell them this god Elikim, he's got it in for you. And if they can help you escape, then the good god Ea is going to bless your socks off. So it's in your best interest to build this boat so I can get away from the other god. And so the people are deceived into building this big boat. The boat gets built in 6 days and 6 nights, thanks to all the mutton and beef and wine he gives all the workers. It's terribly difficult launching the boat. All the other people have to work very hard to launch the boat. They launch the boat, then he puts his family in there, his kin, the craftsmen, silver and gold, of course, tame animals, wild animals, and off he goes. And then the floods come, a terrible tempest. For 6 days and 6 nights it rains and rains and rains. So that part might sound a bit familiar. Then it lands on Mount Nissa. And then he sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. Eventually he leaves. And he sets up a sacrifice. And the gods are so happy. They'd all cowered away before because of the big flood. So now they come down because there's some food. There's a sacrifice going on. And there's this goddess Ishtar. And she says everyone should come here except for the idiot god, basically, that caused all this flood to happen. And but he smells and comes anyhow. And she says, you did a very non-reflective thing. You really should have reflected on this more before you did it. And then Ea has a word to the bad god and says, that was senseless. Shouldn't you have just picked off the evil ones? That would have made a lot more sense. You know, maybe use wolves, maybe use lions, maybe use diseases, maybe use famines, but really the flood. And Elkin, he's a bit sad now, so he makes good. He gets Utnapishtim and his wife, and he blesses them with immortality. Gilgamesh thinks, well, what's in it for me? You know, I'm glad that worked out for you, but how the heck am I going to get to be immortal? Anyway, they send him off, send him back off home. But as they go, as Gilgamesh goes, Utnapishtim says, oh, by the way, there's a particular flower that if you have this flower, you'll be immortal. Gilgamesh thinks, great. He manages to get this flower, but unfortunately on his way home, he loses it to a snake and he dies. So that's the end of the story. Thank you very much. So if you'd all like to stand up, you have 60 seconds to talk about the numerous analogies between Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim and the flood account. 60 seconds.